A quiet man of honor. The sun was dipping low on the horizon as Paul Walker, an elderly black veteran, slowly made his way down the bustling sidewalk toward a local restaurant. He had been here many times, yet today he wore an air of quiet dignity, his shoulders squared despite the slight limp in his step. Paul's modest brown jacket, well worn but meticulously cared for, clung to his frame, and over his chest a service medal glinted faintly, catching the last rays of sunlight. The medal was a simple token, but it meant everything to him, a reminder of years spent serving his country with unwavering loyalty and sacrifice. Today, however, Paul wasn't here for recognition. He was simply seeking a warm meal and a moment of peace. Paul found a seat by the window, taking in the soft glow of the city as evening settled in. Outside, the world moved swiftly, a blur of strangers with their own lives and stories. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax, savoring the tranquility. His life had been filled with memories, some bitter, some sweet. He had fought in wars, seen comrades fall, and felt the weight of loss that only those in service could understand. Now, as he watched the world from his quiet corner, those memories felt like ghosts drifting past the glass, each face a reminder of battles fought and friendships lost. A young waitress named Sarah approached him, her face warm and kind. She welcomed him with a genuine smile, asking for his order without a hint of judgment. Paul felt an unexpected warmth in her presence. Kindness was a rare thing, especially from strangers. He ordered a simple meal, thanking her softly, and she moved away to prepare his order. But this moment of peace was short-lived. Across the room, the restaurant's owner, Mr. Taylor, spotted Paul. Tall and impeccably dressed, Taylor had an air of superiority that he wore like armor. His gaze lingered on Paul with thinly veiled disdain. Taylor was known for his strict expectations of appearance and clientele, and though he wouldn't say it aloud, his standards rarely included people like Paul. The man took a moment to decide before making his way over, his footsteps echoing sharply in the quiet space. "Excuse me, sir," Taylor began, his tone clipped and forced, his eyes cold as they flicked to the medal on Paul's chest. "This establishment maintains a certain atmosphere. I'm afraid we can't serve you here." His words were polite on the surface, but his gaze carried a different message. A message of exclusion, of dismissal, as though Paul's presence somehow stained the room. Paul's heart sank, though he managed to keep his expression calm. He knew this tone, this treatment. He had faced it too many times in his life, and yet it never lost its sting. Gathering his composure, he looked Taylor in the eye. "I just wanted a meal," he replied, his voice gentle but steady, carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the space between them. "I don't want trouble." Taylor, however, was unmoved. His posture stiffened as he cut Paul off, his voice harder now, more insistent. "I'm sure there are other places more suited for you," he said dismissively. "We don't want any disturbances." In that moment, Paul felt a mix of anger and hurt, but he refused to let it show. Years of enduring these indignities had taught him restraint. Without another word, he rose from his seat, abandoning both his meal and the small sanctuary he had hoped to find here. As he turned to leave, he felt the weight of judgment pressing down on him, a weight he had carried for far too long. Back home, in the quiet solitude of his kitchen, Paul sat at the worn wooden table, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. The injustice he had endured gnawed at him, filling him with a sense of hollow disbelief. How could a man who had risked his life for his country be treated with such disrespect in his own homeland? The bitterness rose within him, mingling with memories of battles fought, friends lost, and the sacrifices he had made. A few hours later, his son James walked into the room, immediately sensing the tension in his father's posture. James was a lawyer, a man who had dedicated his life to fighting injustice, and he had always looked up to his father as a symbol of strength and resilience. But tonight, he saw something different, something that made his own heart ache with a fierce, protective anger. "What happened, Dad?" James asked gently, sitting across from him, his gaze filled with concern. Paul hesitated, not wanting to burden his son with his troubles. But the weight of the day was too much to bear alone, and slowly he began to tell James everything. The quiet humiliation, the cold words, the way he had been made to feel small and unworthy. As he listened, James's expression shifted, his jaw clenching with restrained fury. This wasn't just a story of discrimination. It was a deep personal affront to everything his father represented. This was his hero, his father, a man who had faced death on the battlefield and emerged with honor, only to be shamed by a stranger in a restaurant. James took out his phone, recording his father's words with quiet determination. He asked Paul to recount the events in his own words, his voice calm yet layered with emotion. When the recording was done, he posted it online, along with a powerful caption that demanded justice. Within hours, the video spread across social media, resonating with thousands who felt the same outrage, the same disbelief that a veteran, a man who had served his country, could be treated so callously. As night turned to dawn, the world had already begun to respond. Messages flooded in, voices of support from strangers, veterans, activists, and friends. People shared their own stories, recounting instances of prejudice and mistreatment, each tale adding fuel to the fire of change that James had ignited. By morning, the story had become a rallying cry. News outlets began to reach out, eager to interview Paul, to give him a platform to share his truth. And James, standing by his father's side, was ready to help him tell it, determined that the world would hear about the strength, the dignity, and the unbreakable spirit of Paul Walker, the veteran who refused to be diminished. The day ahead would not just be a moment of justice for Paul, but a reckoning for everyone who had ever dared to diminish the worth of a man based on the color of his skin. Paul's quiet dignity, his restrained resilience, had become a beacon, inspiring people everywhere to stand up and demand the respect they deserved. A son's determination. The sun had barely risen when Paul's phone began to ring, a steady stream of notifications lighting up his screen. Messages of solidarity poured in, each one filled with support, outrage, and encouragement. People from every corner of the country, and even beyond, were expressing their shock and anger at what had happened. The story had resonated deeply, touching a nerve in a society grappling with the enduring scars of prejudice and discrimination. For Paul, it was overwhelming, a whirlwind of emotions he wasn't quite prepared for. He had always carried his burdens quietly, never seeking sympathy or attention. But now, his experience had become a symbol, a voice for so many who had faced similar injustices in silence. Meanwhile, James was working tirelessly. He had been up all night, responding to messages, coordinating interviews, and speaking with journalists who wanted to cover his father's story. James was fueled by a fierce, unyielding determination to turn this painful experience into a force for change. His father's dignity, his quiet resilience in the face of humiliation, had ignited something within him, a drive not just to seek justice for Paul, but to bring awareness to the pervasive discrimination that many veterans and people of color still faced. James arranged for a press conference outside the restaurant where the incident had occurred. He knew that confronting the place directly, with the weight of public attention, would send a powerful message. As he made the preparations, he glanced at his father, who sat quietly at the kitchen table, watching him with a mixture of pride and concern. Paul hadn't asked for any of this, but he understood the importance of what was happening. He had spent his life fighting battles, both on the front lines and in his own personal struggles. This was yet another battle, but this time, he wouldn't fight it alone. "Dad," James said gently, placing a hand on Paul's shoulder, "I know this isn't easy for you, but you've been silent long enough. It's time for people to hear your story, for them to understand the sacrifices you made and the dignity you carry, even in the face of disrespect. This isn't just about what happened yesterday. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." Paul looked up at his son, his eyes filled with a quiet strength that had been his anchor through so many storms. He nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I trust you, James," he replied. "If you think this can make a difference, then I'm with you. But I want this to be about more than just me. There are so many others, people who never had the chance to speak up, who had to bear the weight of discrimination in silence. If my story can help them, then I'll stand with you." James felt a surge of pride as he heard his father's words. This wasn't just about seeking justice for one man. It was about giving a voice to an entire community, to all those who had been marginalized, dismissed, or mistreated because of their race or background. James could feel the gravity of what they were about to do, and he was ready to give it everything he had. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher, a crowd began to gather outside the restaurant. Reporters, camera crews, and supporters filled the sidewalk, their presence a silent testament to the power of solidarity. James and Paul arrived together, stepping out of the car and making their way toward the gathering with calm determination. Paul's head was held high, his posture dignified despite the slight limp that reminded everyone of his service. The restaurant's owner, Mr. Taylor, watched from inside, his face pale as he realized the full extent of the situation. What he had thought would be a minor, forgettable incident had spiraled into something far greater, a public reckoning that he couldn't ignore. He glanced nervously at the crowd outside, feeling the weight of their judgment bearing down on him. In his mind, he replayed the encounter with Paul, each word, each dismissive look now magnified by the eyes of an outraged community. James stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice strong and clear as he recounted his father's story. He spoke not only of the humiliation Paul had endured, but also of the sacrifices he had made, the years of service he had given to his country, and the resilience he carried with him every day. His words were powerful, each one resonating with the crowd as they listened intently, their expressions a mix of anger and admiration. As James spoke, Paul stood beside him, his gaze steady as he looked out over the crowd. He could see the faces of people who had come to support him. Some of them veterans like himself, others simply moved by the injustice of his story. For the first time in a long time, Paul felt seen, not as an elderly black man dismissed by society, but as a human being, a man who had given so much and asked for so little in return. After James finished speaking, he turned to his father, giving him a nod of encouragement. Paul hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before stepping forward to address the crowd. His voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of years of experience and hardship. "I didn't come here today looking for sympathy," Paul began, his eyes meeting those of the people before him. "I came here because what happened to me isn't just my story. It's the story of many who have faced prejudice, who have been dismissed, overlooked, and disrespected because of the color of their skin or the clothes they wear. I served this country with pride, just as many others have. And I believe that every person, regardless of their background, deserves to be treated with dignity." The crowd listened in silence, hanging on his every word. Paul's voice was steady, unbroken by anger or bitterness, but filled with a quiet strength that moved everyone who heard him. "I won't let what happened here define me," he continued, his gaze shifting toward the restaurant. "But I want this to be a turning point, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. We all belong. We all deserve respect. And I hope that by standing here today, we can start to change the way we see each other." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, growing louder until it filled the air with a sense of unity and determination. Paul felt a wave of emotion wash over him, humbled by the support he was receiving. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope that things could be different, that the world could be kinder, fairer, and more accepting. As the applause died down, reporters stepped forward, eager to ask questions, to capture every detail of this powerful moment. Paul answered them with grace, each response measured, reflecting the wisdom he had gained through a lifetime of resilience. Inside the restaurant, Mr. Taylor watched, his face pale as he realized the depth of his mistake. He had underestimated Paul, dismissed him without a second thought, and now he was witnessing the strength of a man he had tried to belittle. Taylor felt a pang of regret, though he wasn't yet ready to admit it aloud. As the press conference came to an end, James wrapped an arm around his father's shoulders, pride evident in his eyes. Paul looked at his son, feeling a warmth that went beyond words. He had always been proud of James, of the man he had become, but today, that pride was deeper than ever. Together, they had taken a painful experience and turned it into a message of hope and unity, a call for respect that would echo far beyond this small restaurant. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the impact of Paul's words lingered in the air, a quiet but powerful reminder of the strength of human dignity. As he and James walked away, Paul felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years, knowing that his story had touched lives and planted the seeds of change in the hearts of everyone who had listened. The unyielding spirit of a veteran. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. Paul found himself in a world he hadn't expected, one of media attention, public outcry, and messages of support from people he had never met. Messages poured in from all over the country, even from international supporters who had seen the viral video of the press conference. People of all backgrounds, veterans, families of service members, and countless others who resonated with Paul's story, reached out to express their admiration for his courage and their anger over the injustice he had faced. But amidst the flood of support, there was also backlash. In the shadowed corners of the internet, detractors criticized Paul, saying he was stirring up trouble where there didn't need to be any. Others accused him of exaggerating the story, of playing the victim for attention. These comments stung, but Paul held his head high, keeping his focus on the positive change he hoped his story would inspire. He had faced challenges before, far worse than mere words, and he was determined not to let this stop him. One evening, after a long day of answering calls and responding to letters, Paul sat with his son, James, in the small living room of his modest home. The room was filled with mementos of Paul's past, a faded photograph of his platoon from the war, his carefully framed service medals, and a worn American flag that he had kept close to his heart since the day he left the military. Each item was a piece of his story, a testament to the life he had lived and the sacrifices he had made. James, seated across from his father, looked around the room, taking in these symbols of his father's service and strength. For him, each item was not just a relic, but a reminder of the integrity and resilience Paul had always embodied. Despite the painful experience at the restaurant, James could see that his father had not lost an ounce of his dignity. If anything, Paul's courage and grace had only grown stronger. "Dad," James began, his voice soft but filled with determination, "I think it's time we take this to the next level. This story, your story, is more than just a single incident. It represents so many others who have been treated the same way. You've shown so much dignity, and people need to see that there is strength in standing up for yourself and for others." Paul nodded slowly, absorbing his son's words. He had always believed in leading by example, in being a quiet but steady force of integrity. But perhaps James was right. Perhaps his story could serve as a catalyst for something bigger. "What do you have in mind, son?" Paul asked, his voice measured but intrigued. James leaned forward, his eyes bright with the vision he had been forming. "Let's start a campaign, Dad. Not just a protest or a one-time event, but a real, lasting initiative to combat discrimination, especially toward veterans and people of color. We could call it Stand with Dignity. We'll rally others who have experienced discrimination, create a network of support, and push for real change in policies across businesses. It could even extend beyond restaurants to cover employment, housing, and public services." Paul listened, his heart swelling with pride at his son's ambition and conviction. It was a bold idea, a powerful one, and he could see the impact it might have. The idea of using his painful experience to protect and uplift others resonated deeply with him. It was a mission he could get behind, a purpose that extended beyond his own hurt and into the broader fight for justice and equality. After a moment's silence, Paul nodded, a faint smile breaking through his usually reserved demeanor. "I like that, James. Stand with dignity. It's something we can all get behind. Something that isn't just about one person's story, but about creating respect and fairness for everyone." They spent the next few hours planning, brainstorming ways to bring the campaign to life. James reached out to his contacts, journalists, community organizers, and veteran support networks, while Paul worked on drafting a statement about the mission of Stand with Dignity. As he wrote, he reflected on the importance of community, of standing together in the face of adversity, and of the strength that lay in unity and respect. The first public event they organized was a dignity rally, held in the town square, not far from the restaurant where the incident had taken place. People gathered from neighboring towns, many wearing buttons and shirts with the slogan, "Stand with Dignity," emblazoned on them. Veterans stood proudly in uniform, families held signs, and supporters from all walks of life joined together to stand in solidarity with Paul and his message. As the rally began, James introduced his father, speaking of his unwavering resilience and his dedication to a country that had not always returned the same respect. His words were met with a wave of applause and cheers from the crowd. Paul, dressed in his modest but carefully pressed clothes, his service medal shining on his chest, stepped up to the microphone, taking a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm not here to speak about myself. I'm here because I believe in dignity, in respect, and in standing up for what's right. No one should have to endure the kind of humiliation I faced that day. But I know I'm not alone. So many of you have faced similar injustices, moments where you felt dismissed, disrespected, or unworthy. This rally isn't just about my story. It's about all of us. It's about creating a world where we all feel seen, valued, and respected." As he spoke, Paul looked out at the sea of faces before him. Many were nodding, their expressions filled with empathy and shared pain. For some, his words rekindled memories of their own experiences, moments when they, too, had felt small or invisible. But here, in this gathering, they found strength in each other's presence, in the shared belief that together, they could make a difference. "I may be an old man," Paul continued, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "but I still have fight left in me. I fought for this country, and I'll continue to fight for the values that make it worth fighting for. We cannot allow discrimination and prejudice to go unchallenged. Together, we can be a force for change. Together, we can stand with dignity." The crowd erupted in applause, the energy in the air electric with hope and unity. Paul's words had resonated deeply, his quiet strength and humility a beacon for those who had come to stand beside him. As the rally continued, people stepped forward to share their own stories, each one adding to the collective call for respect and justice. After the rally, Paul and James were approached by several organizations, including veteran support groups, civil rights activists, and even local politicians who expressed interest in supporting the Stand with Dignity campaign. They wanted to help spread its message, to bring its principles into schools, businesses, and government offices, to create policies that would ensure fair and respectful treatment for all. For Paul, it was an overwhelming but deeply fulfilling experience. He had never imagined that a simple meal out would lead to such a movement, that his own small act of resilience would inspire so many. But as he looked at his son, he realized that this was only the beginning. Together, they had sparked a flame, a fire that would continue to burn brightly, fueled by the voices and stories of those who had long been silenced. In the days that followed, Stand with Dignity continued to grow, gaining momentum as more people joined the cause. Paul's story became a rallying cry, a symbol of resilience and the unbreakable human spirit. And as he watched the campaign flourish, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had not only reclaimed his own dignity, but had also helped countless others find theirs. The journey had been painful, and the scars of that day in the restaurant would always remain. But now, Those scars were a testament to his strength, a reminder of his unwavering spirit, and a beacon of hope for all who believed in a world built on respect, equality, and dignity. The price of change. The success of the Stand with Dignity rally marked a pivotal moment in Paul and James's journey. What had begun as a painful incident now morphed into a powerful movement, drawing supporters and skeptics alike into its orbit. For Paul, the transformation from a quiet, dignified life into a public symbol of resilience was surreal and, at times, overwhelming. His days, once marked by a familiar routine, were now filled with interviews, meetings, and speeches. At night, he would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend the weight of the responsibility he now bore. One morning, James entered the living room with a stack of letters, their envelopes worn and crumpled from their journey through countless hands. Some of the letters were from strangers sharing their own stories of discrimination, each one a testament to resilience against cruelty and prejudice. Others came from people expressing gratitude for Paul's bravery, thanking him for sparking a conversation long overdue. As James read them aloud, Paul listened in silence, his heart swelling with pride and a quiet resolve. One morning, James entered the living room with a stack of letters, their envelopes worn and crumpled from their journey through countless hands. Some of the letters were from strangers sharing their own stories of discrimination, each one a testament to resilience against cruelty and prejudice. Others came from people expressing gratitude for Paul's bravery, thanking him for sparking a conversation long overdue. As James read them aloud, Paul listened in silence, his heart swelling with pride and a quiet resolve. But not every message was encouraging. Mixed in with the letters of support were messages of scorn, vitriol from people who saw the movement as an affront to tradition. Anonymous notes labeled him an agitator, a troublemaker, accusing him of trying to stir up racial tension and divide the community. Others mocked his service, questioning whether a man like him deserved the respect he claimed. They were words laced with anger, dripping with contempt, as if challenging Paul's right to speak out. The messages hurt more than Paul let on. He had spent his life embodying a quiet dignity, never seeking the spotlight or asking for praise. Now, thrust into this unexpected role, he faced not only the support of a grateful public, but the bitterness of those unwilling to confront the truths he exposed. Each hateful letter was like a stone added to the weight already resting on his shoulders, a reminder that his stand for justice would not come without a price. One afternoon, as they sorted through another pile of mail, James looked up at his father, concern etched into his face. "Dad, maybe we should slow down. You don't have to carry this burden alone. We have supporters, allies. Let them do some of the speaking, take on some of the weight." Paul paused, his hands resting on a letter that bore no return address. He knew James was right, but he also understood that stepping away would mean relinquishing control of a narrative that was deeply personal to him. This wasn't just a movement, it was his life, his story, and in some ways, his redemption. "I appreciate your concern, James," Paul said, his voice steady but gentle. "But if I step back now, what does that say to those who are looking to me for strength? We've started something important here. I need to see it through." James nodded, though his worry didn't abate. He knew his father's resolve was unbreakable, a trait forged through years of service and sacrifice. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this newfound fame and responsibility were taking a toll on his father, a toll that neither of them could fully measure. Over the following weeks, as Stand with Dignity continued to gain momentum, Paul found himself facing a series of challenges that tested his resolve. Media outlets began digging into his past, searching for any detail, any misstep that could cast doubt on his credibility. Reporters showed up unannounced, lingering near his house, hoping for a chance to catch him off guard. Tabloids published stories that distorted his life, painting him as a divisive figure instead of the humble veteran he had always been. One morning, while walking down Main Street, Paul noticed whispers trailing behind him. People he had known for years now looked at him differently, their eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and judgment. Some greeted him warmly, expressing pride in his stand for justice. Others cast wary glances, as if associating with him was somehow controversial. The most painful reaction, however, came from people he considered friends. Men who had once shared a laugh with him at the local diner now avoided eye contact, their faces tight with discomfort. They had known him as Paul, a friendly neighbor, a war veteran. But now, his role as a public figure seemed to overshadow the man they once respected. They saw him as a symbol, and that symbol threatened the comfort of their ignorance. One evening, Paul sat alone on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet street. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness he hadn't experienced since his days in the military, when he would lie awake at night, surrounded by the quiet breaths of his sleeping comrades, yet feeling worlds apart. As the shadows grew, James joined him on the porch, settling into the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Paul broke the silence. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing, son?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if the question itself was a betrayal of his resolve. James turned to him, his gaze steady. "Dad, you've inspired people. You've given them a voice. It's not easy, and I know it's taking a toll, but you're making a difference. The fact that you're willing to face all this, despite the backlash, the threats, that's exactly why it matters. People are listening because they see your strength." Paul nodded, taking comfort in his son's words. Yet the doubt lingered, like an ache that refused to fade. He knew the journey they had started was necessary, but he couldn't deny the toll it was taking on his spirit. The solitude, the scrutiny, the friends lost, all were sacrifices he hadn't anticipated. Days later, as he walked through town, he noticed a young man standing outside a store, holding a small sign that read, "Veterans deserve respect." The man looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable but resolute in his stance. When he noticed Paul, he straightened, his face lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You're the reason I'm here. I watched your story, and it reminded me of my own granddad. He was a veteran too, and he taught me to always stand up for what's right. Thank you for everything you're doing." Paul felt a surge of gratitude, a warmth that soothed the ache in his heart. This young man, with his quiet courage and unwavering respect, was a reminder of the impact his story was having on people he would never meet. For every person who turned away, there were others who stood beside him, drawn to the truth he had exposed. The campaign continued, growing stronger with each passing day. People from all walks of life joined Stand with Dignity, sharing their own experiences and amplifying the message of respect and equality. Businesses began reaching out, asking for training sessions and workshops on cultural sensitivity. Schools and community centers requested materials to educate their members on issues of discrimination and justice. Slowly, Paul's story began to reshape the narrative, transforming a painful experience into a powerful force for change. But despite the progress, Paul knew there was still work to be done. The price of change was steep, and he would continue to pay it as long as he had the strength. With each step he took, he carried the weight of those who had been silenced, those who had endured similar injustices without a platform to speak. One evening, as he stood before a gathering of veterans and community members, Paul spoke from his heart, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Change doesn't come easy. It demands sacrifice, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to truth. I may be just one man, but together, we are a force that cannot be ignored. We're here to remind the world that dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. As the audience rose to their feet, their applause a roar of solidarity, Paul felt a profound sense of purpose. This journey, though fraught with hardship, was one he would not abandon. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in a world built on respect and justice. And as he looked into the faces of those who stood with him, he realized that he was no longer alone. Together, they were building something lasting, something powerful, a legacy that would endure long after his story had faded. The price of change was high, but Paul knew it was a price worth paying. For in the end, he had found something more valuable than comfort or peace. He had found purpose, ripples of change. In the days following the Stand with Dignity rally, the energy sparked by Paul's story spread far beyond the town's borders. News outlets, captivated by the image of an elderly veteran standing resolute against prejudice, ran stories highlighting the growing movement. Social media lit up with hashtags like #StandWithDignity, #VeteransDeserveRespect, and #RespectAll, with people from all over sharing their own experiences of discrimination and resilience. For Paul, it was a surreal experience. He had gone from a private man to the face of a public crusade. A reluctant hero now leading a cause he never could have imagined himself at the center of. Despite his humble nature, he recognized the unique power his story carried. It wasn't just about him. It was about all the people whose voices had been silenced, whose dignity had been disregarded. He was merely a vessel for their collective pain and hope. One morning, as Paul walked through town, he noticed subtle changes around him. Local businesses had placed signs in their windows reading, "All are welcome here." The coffee shop where he once felt the sting of disapproving stares now greeted him warmly, the staff making an extra effort to show respect and hospitality. Even Mr. Taylor's restaurant, the place where the entire ordeal began, had closed for renovations. Rumors circulated that Taylor was under pressure from the town council to implement new policies that would ensure fair treatment for all patrons. The townspeople, who had once looked at Paul with either indifference or judgment, now greeted him with nods of respect. Some even stopped to thank him, expressing how his bravery had opened their eyes to the hidden prejudices they'd never questioned. Paul accepted their gratitude with humility, yet there was a lingering sadness in his heart. These changes, while meaningful, had come at a cost he felt deeply every day. One evening, as Paul sat at his kitchen table, a familiar ache settled in his chest. He missed the quiet life he'd once led, the simple comfort of moving through the world unnoticed. He hadn't asked for this responsibility, nor had he ever sought to be the focal point of such a divisive issue. The toll of it weighed on him, the hateful letters, the friends who had distanced themselves, and the countless hours spent on phone calls and meetings with activists and journalists. James, sensing the strain on his father, visited him that night. They sat in comfortable silence, a deep understanding passing between them. Paul finally broke the quiet, his voice heavy. "Son, I never wanted to be anyone's hero. I just wanted a bit of peace and respect. Sometimes I wonder if all this," he gestured to the stacks of letters and clippings on the table, "is really worth it." James reached across the table, placing a hand on his father's. "Dad, you didn't choose this fight, but you're the only one who could carry it with such grace. People are listening because they see your strength. You're changing lives, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." Paul nodded, absorbing his son's words, though the weight of his journey still pressed heavily on him. Deep down, he knew that James was right. This was bigger than his own discomfort, and the small ripples of change he was witnessing were proof that his stand mattered. A week later, Paul received an unexpected phone call. A representative from the town council wanted to meet with him to discuss creating a Veterans Respect initiative. The initiative, as the council explained, was intended to honor veterans and promote awareness about the discrimination they often faced. They wanted Paul's input, hoping to build a program that would reflect the values he had so publicly embodied. When Paul arrived at the town hall for the meeting, he was met with a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Council members, local business owners, community leaders, and even a few veterans from neighboring towns had gathered to discuss the initiative. Paul felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. He was honored to be there, but wary of becoming a symbol in a room full of people he once felt invisible to. The council president, a tall, serious woman named Eleanor Hart, opened the meeting with a brief speech. "Mr. Walker," she said, addressing Paul directly, "your story has highlighted an issue that many of us were blind to. We owe you our gratitude and an apology. You shouldn't have had to endure what you did. Today, we want to create a program that will ensure that all veterans, and indeed all citizens, are treated with the respect they deserve." Paul listened intently as Eleanor and the other council members outlined their plans. They discussed educational programs for local businesses, awareness campaigns, and a public monument dedicated to veterans in the town square. The initiative, they explained, was intended to be both a tribute and a commitment to ongoing change, a tangible reminder that respect was a right, not a privilege. When it was Paul's turn to speak, he stood slowly, gathering his thoughts. He looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze, his own eyes filled with a quiet conviction. "I'm grateful for all of you here today, and I'm glad my story has sparked something meaningful. But this isn't just about me, or even just about veterans. This is about every person who has felt unseen, disrespected, or unwelcome. I want this initiative to remind people that dignity is a basic human right. It doesn't matter where you come from or what you look like. Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and respect." The room fell silent as Paul's words resonated with everyone present. He had transformed his personal pain into a universal message, one that transcended his own experience. The council members nodded, visibly moved, and Eleanor assured him that his vision would guide the initiative. As the meeting concluded, several people approached Paul, offering words of thanks and encouragement. One of them, a young woman from the local historical society, handed him a small pamphlet. "We'd like to feature you in an exhibit we're creating on local heroes," she said shyly. "Your story is an important part of our town's history now." Paul accepted the pamphlet, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. He never saw himself as a hero, just a man trying to live with integrity. But if his story could inspire others to stand up for themselves and each other, then perhaps this unexpected journey was worth it. In the weeks that followed, Paul watched as the Veterans Respect Initiative took shape. Murals honoring veterans appeared on the walls of local buildings, each one telling a story of courage and sacrifice. Schools introduced history lessons focused on the contributions of Black veterans, bringing visibility to their overlooked service. The town's businesses underwent training sessions, teaching employees about respect, inclusion, and cultural sensitivity. But the most profound change was the one Paul saw in the people around him. The townspeople, once indifferent or even hostile, now went out of their way to show him respect. People who had once looked at him with disdain now greeted him with warm smiles and firm handshakes. Even those who had been silent during his ordeal seemed to recognize the importance of his journey, offering quiet nods of acknowledgement as he passed by. One afternoon, as he walked through the town square, Paul noticed a group of young children playing near the newly erected Veterans Monument. Their laughter filled the air, a reminder of the innocence and kindness he had fought to preserve. He approached the monument, running his fingers over the engraved names of veterans, his heart swelling with gratitude. Standing there, surrounded by the legacy of his fellow servicemen, Paul felt a profound sense of peace. His journey had been filled with pain and sacrifice, but in the end, it had led to something beautiful, a community united in respect, a legacy built on dignity and compassion. As he turned to leave, a young boy approached him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you the man from the stories?" the boy asked, his voice filled with awe. Paul smiled, bending down to meet the boy's gaze. "I suppose I am," he replied, his tone gentle. "But remember, it's not just my story. It's all of ours. Always treat others with respect, no matter who they are. That's the real story." The boy nodded, absorbing Paul's words, and Paul walked away, his heart light. He had faced his struggle with dignity, and in doing so, he had changed his town forever. The ripples of his journey would continue, spreading kindness, respect, and understanding in ways he could only imagine. And in that moment, Paul knew that he had found the peace he had longed for, not in the quiet corners of life, but in the profound, unyielding power of standing for what was right. The legacy of dignity. The Veterans Respect Initiative was now woven into the very fabric of the town, transforming it from a place marked by discrimination to one remembered for resilience, respect, and unity. Murals honoring veterans, statues representing bravery, and plaques telling forgotten stories stood as silent witnesses to a town's journey toward awareness. Paul could see these changes everywhere he looked, in the greetings of his neighbors, the smiles of strangers, and in the awe-filled glances he received from children who had come to view him as a local legend. One crisp morning, Paul received an invitation to speak at the dedication ceremony for a new veterans center named in his honor, the Walker Center for Veterans and Community. The building stood at the edge of town, its walls made of sturdy brick and its roof adorned with an American flag waving proudly against the clear sky. The center would provide support services, job training, therapy sessions, and community activities for veterans of all backgrounds. Paul felt a surge of pride and humility as he gazed at the building, realizing that his stand for dignity had created a lasting impact that would reach veterans long after he was gone. James, who had been by his father's side throughout this journey, stood proudly next to him, a hand on his shoulder. "Dad," he said softly, "you did this. You turned something painful into something powerful. You didn't just change this town. You changed lives." Paul nodded, absorbing his son's words. Though he'd never set out to become a public figure, he could see now how his decision to stand firm in the face of prejudice had inspired a ripple effect, touching hearts and opening minds. It had taken great courage to confront his own pain, but even greater courage to channel it into change. He had, in a sense, found healing through the transformation he'd inspired in others. The ceremony was set to begin in a few minutes, and the crowd was already gathered outside the center. Veterans from different eras and backgrounds stood side by side, each of them dressed with pride, their service medals glinting in the sunlight. Community members, town officials, and even media representatives had come to bear witness to this monumental moment. As Paul took his place at the podium, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders, a history marked by both hardship and triumph. He began his speech with a quiet voice, addressing the crowd with a humility that only deepened the respect they felt for him. "I'm just one man," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "One man who wanted a meal in a restaurant, but my journey taught me that dignity isn't just a personal right. It's a foundation of community, of decency. Dignity is what we owe to each other, not because of our titles, our uniforms, or our bank accounts, but because of our shared humanity." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, seeing in them a mixture of pride, admiration, and solidarity. He continued, "When I was turned away from that restaurant, I felt a deep, searing pain. Not because I was denied a meal, but because I was denied respect. That moment could have crushed me, but it didn't, because I realized that I had the power to turn that pain into purpose, to demand, not just for myself, but for every person who's been told they don't belong, that they are worthy of respect." Paul's words moved through the crowd like a current, touching each person individually. Veterans in the audience stood taller, some dabbing tears from their eyes, while community members nodded, seeing the transformation their town had undergone through his journey. He shared stories of his time in the military, recalling his brothers in arms, men and women of different races and backgrounds who had fought side by side with him. In those moments of danger, we didn't see color or class or anything but the person next to us. We saw courage, loyalty, and humanity. If we could see each other that way then, surely we can see each other that way now. Paul took a deep breath, steadying himself as he felt the weight of his own emotions. "I am deeply honored by this center. But let this building stand as a testament, not to me, but to all of us who choose dignity over division, who see our differences not as barriers, but as bridges." As he finished, the crowd erupted in applause, but it was the silence that followed that left the most profound impact. People stood quietly, as if absorbing not just his words, but the journey he had taken them on. It was in that silence that Paul knew his message had truly resonated, sinking into the hearts of those who had come to listen, to learn, and to remember. After the ceremony, a line of people formed, each waiting to shake Paul's hand, to thank him, to share a personal story. Some were veterans who had faced similar injustices. Others were community members who had been touched by his resilience. But one person stood out, a young black man named Darnell, who looked at Paul with reverence. "Mr. Walker," Darnell said, his voice filled with emotion, "I just want you to know that because of you, I've found the strength to stand up for myself. I've always been afraid to speak out, to demand respect. But you showed me that our dignity is worth fighting for. Thank you." Paul's heart swelled as he looked into Darnell's eyes, seeing a reflection of his own younger self. "Hold on to that strength," he said, his voice thick. "It'll carry you through." The hours that followed were filled with conversations, handshakes, and embraces. Paul felt a warmth spreading through him, a sense of peace and fulfillment that he hadn't known in years. The battles he had fought, both on the battlefield and in his heart, had led to this moment, this profound, unexpected victory. As the day wound down, James joined him, a look of deep admiration in his eyes. "Dad, you've done more than anyone could ever ask. This town, this center, the people, they're all better because of you." Paul smiled, his gaze drifting over the crowd. "I didn't do it alone, son. It took a community. It took people willing to see the truth and stand by it." They walked together through the town square, where a small plaque had been placed in Paul's honor. The words inscribed on it captured the essence of his journey. "In honor of Paul Walker, who taught us that dignity is not given but demanded, and respect is not earned but inherent. May his legacy remind us always to stand for what is right." As Paul read the words, he felt a deep sense of closure. His journey had come full circle. The pain he had endured, the injustice he had faced, had all led to something far greater than himself, a movement, a legacy, a change in the hearts of those who had once been strangers. That evening, Paul sat alone on a bench in the square, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The town was quiet, peaceful, the air filled with the scent of autumn leaves. He closed his eyes, breathing in the moment, feeling a profound sense of calm. His life, marked by hardship, had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that dignity, though fragile, is also fiercely resilient. And as he sat there, the world felt lighter, the burden he had carried now shared by a community that had finally come to see him, not as a stranger, not as an outsider, but as a man deserving of respect, honor, and love. And in that quiet, in the soft glow of twilight, Paul knew that he had found his true legacy, not in his medals, not in the monuments, but in the hearts he had touched, the lives he had changed, and the dignity he had reclaimed for himself and countless others.